Good morning. It is Tuesday, June the 4th, and this is The Drill. And thank you very much. My name is Ronald T. Hardgrove, and this is my podcast called The Drill, and it's about being a true conservative and the differences between being a true conservative and being a reactionary. My podcast is made possible by Spreaker.com. My email address is storytimes@hotmail.com. I'm on Twitter at Ronald Hardgrove and on Facebook, and the page is called The Drill. You're not a Trump supporter, are you? You're not a conservative, are you? So you believe that anyone who questions President Obama's nationality isn't racist? How you deal with these questions determines whether or not you're truly conservative. What is a true conservative? Well, I'll give you an example. The left is always looking to create movements towards socialist paradise. And a reactionary is a person that's dogmatic and defiant of those movements and seeks to create counter-movements. Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity, Glenn Beck, and Hugh Hewitt are just a few examples of reactionaries. A true conservative is open-minded, but unmoved unless there is a good reason to do so. Being truly conservative is also about integrity. Maintaining your integrity is about listening carefully, reading carefully. It's about not getting tricked, about responding and not reacting. Integrity is also about how you live, not just how you vote. True conservatives are not merely true conservatism, let's say, is not merely a political identity, but a philosophical reality. True conservatism is fundamentally about being realistic, and being realistic is fundamentally about making the presumption for the status quo. So that's my introduction to my show and what it is all about. And when I come back, I've got instead of doing the Op Hawkeye Instagram, I've got a new book that I want to read from in its place when I come back. Well, due to technical difficulties, I'm going to be reading from the Ayn Rand lexicon and sharing with you the concept of the day. And the concept of the day is free will. That which you call your soul or spirit is your consciousness, and that which you call free will is your mind's freedom to think or not. The only will you have, your only freedom, the choice that controls all the choices you make and determines your life and your character. To think is an act of choice. The key to what you so recklessly call human nature, the open secret you live with, yet dread to name, is the fact that man is a being of volitional consciousness. Reason does not work automatically. Thinking is not a mechanical process. The connections of logic are not made by instinct. The function of your stomach, lungs, or heart is automatic. The function of your mind is not. In any hour and issue of your life, you are free to think or to evade that effort, but you are not free to escape from your nature, from the fact that reason is your means of survival. So that for you, who are a human being, the question to be or not to be, is the question to think or not to think. A being of volitional consciousness has no automatic course of behavior. He needs a code of values to guide his actions. Man's consciousness shares with animals the first two stages of its development, sensations and perceptions. But it is the third state, conceptions, that make him man. Sensations are integrated into perceptions automatically by the brain of a man or of an animal. But to integrate perceptions into conceptions by a process of abstraction is a feat that man alone has the power to perform. And he has to perform it by choice. The process of abstraction and of concept formation is a process of reason, of thought. It is not automatic, nor instinctive, nor involuntary, nor infallible. Man has to initiate it, to sustain it, and to bear responsibility for its results. The preconceptual level of consciousness is non-volitional. Volition begins with the first syllogism. Man has the choice to think or to evade, to maintain a state of full awareness, or to drift from moment to moment in a semi-conscious daze at the mercy of whatever associational whims the unfocused unfocused mechanism of his consciousness produces. Reason is the faculty that identifies and integrates the material provided by man's senses. It is a faculty that man has to exercise by choice. Thinking is not an automatic function. In any hour and issue of his life, man is free to think or to evade that effort. Thinking requires a state of full, focused awareness. The act of focusing one's consciousness is volitional. Man can focus his mind to a full, active, purposefully directed awareness of reality, or he can unfocus it and let himself drift in a semi-conscious daze, merely reacting to any chance stimulus of the immediate moment, at the mercy of his undirected sensory perceptual mechanism and of any random associational connections it might happen to make. When man unfocuses his mind, he may be said to be conscious in a subhuman sense of the word, since he experiences sensations and perceptions, but in the sense of the word applicable to man, in the sense of a consciousness, which is aware of reality and able to deal with it, a consciousness able to direct the actions and provide for the survival of a human being. An unfocused mind is not conscious. Psychologically, the choice to think or not is the choice to focus or not. Existentially, the choice to focus or not is the choice to be conscious or not. Metaphysically, the choice to be conscious or not is the choice of life or death. A process of thought is not automatic, nor instinctive, nor involuntary, nor infallible. Man has to initiate it, to sustain it, and to bear responsibility for its results. He has to discover how to tell what is true or false and how to correct his own errors. He has to discover how to validate his concepts, his conclusions, his knowledge. He has to discover the rules of thought, the laws of logic, to direct his thinking. Nature gives him no automatic guarantee of the efficacy of his mental effort. And that will do it for today. That's part one of the concept of concept formation. So, and it is the concept of the day. So, when I come back, I'm going to be reading from the book, The Reactionary Mind. Thank you very much. Welcome back. And The Reactionary Mind, and it's a book I found the other day. And let's see what this, anyways, we'll deal with that in a minute. But The Reactionary Mind, and I liked it because it really starts to point up the differences between being reactionary and being a conservative, although in the book, the author has a tendency to conflate the two. But there is another reason we should be wary of the effort to dismiss the reactionary thrust of conservatism, and that is the testimony of the tradition itself. Ever since Burke, it has been a point of pride among conservatives that theirs is a contingent mode of thought. Unlike their opponents on the left, they do not unfurl a blueprint in advance of events. They read situations and circumstances, not texts and tomes. Their preferred mode is adaptation and intimation rather than assertion and declamation. There's a certain truth to this claim, as we will see. The conservative mind is extraordinarily supple, alert to changes in context and fortune long before others realize they are occurring. With his deep awareness of the passage of time, the conservative possesses a tactical virtuosity only few can match. It seems only logical that conservatism would be intimately bound up with, its antenna ever sensitive to, the movements and counter-movements of power sketched above. These are, as I've said, the story of modern politics, and it would seem strange if a mind so attuned to the contingencies around it were not well versed in that story. Not just well versed, but awakened and aroused by it as by no other story. Indeed, from Burke's claim that he and his ilk had been alarmed into reflection by the French Revolution to Russell Kirk's admission that conservatism is a, quote, system of ideas, unquote, that, quote, has sustained men in their resistance against radical theories and social transformation ever since the beginning of the French Revolution, unquote. The conservatives constantly affirmed that his is a knowledge produced in reaction to the left. Burke would go on to lay down as his foundation the notion that never greater an evil had existed than the French Revolution. Sometimes that affirmation has been explicit. 3 times Prime Minister Salisbury wrote in 1859 that, quote, hostility to radicalism, incessant, implacable hostility, is the essential definition of conservatism. The fear that radicals may triumph is the only final cause that the Conservative Party can plead for its own existence, unquote. More than a half century later, his son, Hugh Cecil, among other things, best man at Winston Churchill's wedding and provost of Eton, reaffirmed the father's stance. Quote, I think the government will find in the end that there is only one way of defeating revolutionary tactics, and that is by presenting an organized body of thought which is non-revolutionary. That body of thought I call conservatism, unquote. Others, like Peel, have taken a more circuitous route to get to the same place. My object for some years past, that which I have most earnestly labored to accomplish, has been to lay the foundation of a great party, which, existing in the House of Commons and deriving its strength from the popular will, should diminish the risk and deaden the shock of a collision between the two deliberative branches of the legislature, which should enable us to check the too importunate eagerness of well-intending men for hasty and precipitate change in the Constitution and laws of the country, and by which we should be enabled to say with a voice of authority to the restless spirit of revolutionary change, quote, here are thy bounds, and here shall thy vibrations cease, unquote. So, again, he is basically saying that being a reactionary and being a conservative are the same thing, and perhaps that's the way that they thought about it when, back in Burke's day, back in the 1700s, but it's wrong. It's absolutely wrong. Again, the question of conservatism is, what is it that we're conserving and why? What is the philosophical basis for conservatism? And if there is no philosophical basis, then conservatism becomes nothing more or less than a floating abstraction, a fantasy, and again, just merely reactionary, sitting around waiting for the left to make some type of try to create some kind of a movement, and then trying to make some type of an effort to block that movement. There are some movements that are worth, joining. The movement against slavery, the movement against Jim Crow. Those, to name but two. Those are worthy movements. And the issue of change is, again, do you make the presumption for it, or do you make the presumption for the status quo? To make the presumption for change is wrong. Because we live in a benevolent universe, and we know that by the evidence of our senses, and because to make the presumption for change puts one's intellectual opponents in the untenable position of having to prove a negative. And it is impossible to prove a negative. It is impossible to prove why it is that change should not occur. However, it is possible, doable, and has been done to prove that change should occur and why it should occur and what changes more specifically. So from that, we can deduce that it is up to conservatives not to just blindly stand in the way of change, but to be thoughtful. It is our responsibility to be thoughtful. The left wants to act on impulse. They want to be activistic. They want to act first, think later. It is the job of conservatives to do the opposite. It is our job to think first and be moved to action only when there is an obvious case to be moved to action. So, I'll be that wraps this up. This particular book for the moment, The Reactionary Mind, and I'll be back in a minute. Thank you very much. Welcome back. I'm going to now move to Out of the Ashes, Rebuilding American Culture, which I had finished up Chapter 2 yesterday, and today I'm going to begin Chapter 3, A Mind is a Terrible Thing to Baste, Restoring the School. And I want to emphasize that it is philosophy that informs our culture, and a culture that informs and directs our politics. Rush Limbaugh says explicitly that it is politics that shapes everything in the country. That's why his show is so politically oriented, because his belief is that if only we could elect the right people at the right time and in the right places, then everything else will fall into place. Baloney. We're not going to get the right people elected unless we have the right philosophy and the right culture. One summer, my family and I visited Orwell Corners, the site of an old farming village on Prince Edward Island. If there is anything that English speakers know about the island, it is that Lucy Maud Montgomery lived there and used it as the setting for her stories about Anne Shirley, the orphan girl and eponymous heroine of Anne of Green Gables, and a spate of other novels. Anne is an excellent student, and in fact, much of the interest of the novels centers around the life of the mind, whether Anne's friendship with her fellow student Diana, her rivalry and then her deepening regard for Gilbert Blythe, or her having to balance her longing to learn with her duties to the family that opened its home to her. Perhaps that explains the enormous popularity of the books in Japan, the land of studiousness, especially among Japanese women, several of whom we saw in the lobby of our hotel. The rich red clay of Prince Edward Island was good for growing potatoes and serious Presbyterians. That became clear to us at Orwell Corners. There was a one-room schoolhouse on the site, something that is irresistible to me and my family. It opened in 1895 and closed only late in 1969. The village, too, closed. That is, the people moved away, so that what is there now is a restoration. But the woman who worked the general store told us that she was among the last graduates of the school in the year when it closed. She loved that school dearly. I have met a few people who attended one-room schools, and every one of them has beamed with gratitude and delight, remembering the peculiar features: boys chopping wood for the burner, a two-seat outhouse in the back, the older students sometimes helping the younger with their lessons, the younger overhearing the lessons of their elders and learning them almost before they learned them, everyone knowing everyone in their families, play in the yard before and after, a feeling of being home. In their justified pride, the caretakers of the schoolhouse, now a museum piece of Canadiana, had collected actual lessons written up by the first students of the school in 1895. I don't think they offered these artifacts as a reproach to the modern world, but they surely were that. Two of the lessons stand out in my mind. Each took up a single sheet of paper. One of them was headed by a couple of verses of devotional poetry. Beneath the verses, the students had passed every word in the verses, every word in the verses, describing what part of speech it was, what grammatical form it bore, case, number, and gender for nouns and adjectives, person, number, tense, mood, and voice for verbs, what function it served in its clause, and what relation it bore to other words. The student's performance was entirely correct. The other lesson was obviously an introductory one. The student wrote a noun in its singular and plural forms in the nominative, genitive, dative, and accusative cases. The second student was clearly one of the younger children, as you could tell from the occasional roughness in his printing. The word in question was doulos, Greek for servant. The children were evidently studying koine, Greek, so as to be able to read the New Testament in the original tongue. I'll give more examples of what our schools once taught, but that is not my first point here. Sure, none of my college freshmen, except for those very few who have both studied Latin and been instructed in Latin's relations to English, know any grammar. There is no grammar in grammar school, and there is not much school there either. Yet before we even get to that, we have to address the massive thing that stares out at us from its 50 blank windows. It is not that Prince Edward Island has changed in the way that an organization grows and develops its latent capacities. It is not that this school has changed, as a young lad will find his voice dropping into the tenor and the baritone, while his arms and legs and shoulders catch up with his hands and feet, and youth blooms and flourishes and becomes manhood in its prime. It is that old Prince Edward Island is dead, and the old place called school is dead. A monstrous thing has taken place. Not just a parasite or a cancer feeding off the host, but a disease that has slowly transformed the host into itself like an all-eating and all-digesting alien. The word school remains, but not the reality. Try to imagine someone armed with directives from Ottawa marching up to Anne Shirley, now a teacher, and telling her that she must instruct the little boys in, quote, sexual expression, unquote, and, quote, transgender rights, unquote. When she narrows her eyes and wonders who gave the government official the authority to dictate to her what is best for her charges, rendering their parents irrelevant and obnoxiously presuming to overrule nature itself, she is subject to a barrage of contempt from someone who has not 1/50th of her knowledge of arts and letters or of the human realities of men and women, boys and girls. If Anne of Green Gables persists, she is fired and replaced by someone, usually a woman, call her Susie of the sex shop, who is strangely eager to impart this instruction, though we may question her equal eagerness to impart what little knowledge she may have of poetry or scripture or British history. Try to imagine and explain to the old farmers of Prince Edward Island the need to teach small children how to insert, safely of course, and aseptically of course, their fingers or tongues or other protuberances into the orifice of another kid of ambiguous sex, including the anus. It is not that they would disagree with you. It is not that they would have an alternative opinion about behavior that makes old-fashioned sodomy look like a peck on the cheek. It is that they would think that you had lost your mind. They would believe that you were suffering a terrifying moral and psychological illness, nigh unto demonic possession, or perhaps well past it. Would they let you speak to their children? They would not want you to speak to their parents or friends or anybody, not because they would be afraid you might persuade or entice one of them, but merely to spare their loved ones the experience of something so gross, so wicked, so repulsive, so sad. They themselves in future years would let the memory of it drop into the darkness and the silence. You do not make scrapbooks of slime. And that is the first part of chapter 3, Out of the Ashes, Rebuilding American Culture. I think it's interesting that he is using a book actually from an English author centered in Canada. The story of which apparently was, again, Canadian. But it was English. But anyways, to illustrate the point of the decline of the American school, and apparently the decline of Canadian schools as well. But that brings me to the conclusion of another episode of The Drill. Let me think for a second here. No, it's not. I have one last thing that I wanted to cover here. Let's see. Okay, and that is One of the other things I want to cover was about being a true conservative and about making the presumption for the status quo, and what does it mean to make the presumption for the status quo? It means that we recognize, first and foremost, that we recognize the benevolence of the universe and the expectation of success. And we recognize that by the evidence of our senses. It is vitally important that we, as conservatives, recognize that. We make the presumption for the United States of America and all its institutions, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and trifurcated government. We do not try to turn the United States into another country, either real or imagined. We make the presumption for the evidence of our senses. And now, that brings us to the conclusion of another episode of The Drill. And until next time, thank you very much for listening, and have a great day.